The debris field didn't have a name worth remembering. In the Dominion star charts, it was logged as Sector 7 Gamma Null, the kind of designation cartographers use when they don't expect anyone to care. A loose sprawl of broken rock and dead ice, the leftover remains of a moon that had come apart sometime in the last million years, drifting in slow silence at the outer edge of what the Dominion had recently begun calling Reclamation Zone 9. The name was bureaucratic and cold, the way all Dominion names for new territories were functional, impersonal, already assuming ownership before the conversation had even started. Admiral Vasquez had overseen 41 of these conversations. That was the word the Dominion used internally. Conversations. It was a polite word for a process that wasn't particularly polite, but 3,000 years of expansion had smoothed the language down until the rough edges didn't show anymore. You arrived. You demonstrated capability. You offered terms. The other party accepted. The conversation was over. It had worked 41 times without variation, against species that ranged from ancient and sophisticated to barely post-industrial. And in all 41 cases the outcome had been the same, not because the Dominion was cruel, but because it was overwhelming, and overwhelming force has a clarity to it that sophisticated argument often lacks. He stood at the forward observation deck of the Eternal Dominion, his flagship, a vessel so large that 3 separate civilizations had initially classified it as a natural object on their long-range sensors. He was not, by nature or by training, a nervous being. 200 years of service had given him the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough to know that most things resolve themselves if you give them time and apply appropriate pressure. He had the calm of a man who had never lost. He was staring at his sensor display, with an expression his crew had never seen on his face before. It was confusion, pure and simple confusion. His science officer, a Velhari named Prethsan, stood at her console with all 4 of her hands motionless, which was something Vasquez had never seen in 11 years of serving alongside her. Velhari were constitutionally incapable of stillness. It was, in their biology, a stress response. The hand stopped when the mind was processing something it didn't have a category for. "Run it again," Vasquez said. "I've run it 4 times, Admiral." "Run it again." She ran it again. The result was identical. The object sitting motionless in the debris field, the dark, angular shape visible through the observation glass, enormous and brutal and unmistakably designed by something with a military intent, registered on every sensor array aboard the most advanced flagship in the Galactic Dominion as nothing. Not low emissions, not minimal power signature, nothing. The instruments looked at it and returned the same reading they returned when pointed at empty space. "A vessel of that displacement," Vasquez said carefully, "cannot maintain structural integrity in open space without generating thermal output." "No," Prethsan agreed, "it cannot. The laws of thermodynamics are not negotiable." "No, they are not." "So what is that?" It wasn't a question, which was why she didn't answer it. Through the observation glass, the shape sat in the debris field with the patience of something that had been there a long time and intended to be there a while longer. It was dark, not the dark of a ship running on minimal power, with the faint warmth of life support and reactor containment bleeding into the infrared, but genuinely dark, the kind of dark that meant the hull itself was doing something unusual with the light that hit it. The design was all hard angles and reinforced geometry, the aesthetic of an engineer who had decided that anything which didn't serve a structural purpose was weight that would get you killed. Gun emplacements along the flanks, launch bays, a prow shaped like the leading edge of an axe. It was unmistakably a warship. And it was sitting in the outer edge of what the Dominion had designated human space, which meant it was a human warship, which meant it belonged to a species that had achieved interstellar travel 80 years ago and was, by every metric in the Dominion's intelligence files, primitive. Vasquez had read those files. He'd read them the way a man reads about a place he expects to visit briefly, enough to be informed, not enough to be surprised. The files said what they always said about young species: limited FTL capability, inefficient energy weapons, basic hull materials, small interstellar presence. 11 systems in 80 years. The Dominion had covered that kind of ground in its first decade. He had brought 14 warships. It was, by any calculation, overkill. He was still thinking about the word overkill when the dark ship fired, and the Dominion's Reach, his lead dreadnought, 37 years of service, survivor of the Battle of the Keth Corridor, the most heavily armored vessel in his fleet, came apart in 4 seconds. Not damaged, not disabled, gone. A cloud of superheated gas and fragmenting metal that expanded outward in the silence of space, and then nothing where a warship had been. 4 seconds. Vasquez heard his own voice, very calm, saying battle stations. He heard the alert systems engage throughout the ship. He heard his crew moving with the practiced efficiency of people who trained for this constantly and experienced it almost never. He watched the dark ship begin to move. It was coming toward them. Commander Yethrow appeared at his shoulder, young enough that his face still showed things before he could stop it. What it showed now was the same thing Vasquez was feeling, that specific, cold quality of encountering something that doesn't fit the model you built your confidence on. Orders, Admiral. All batteries, target acquisition on the human vessel, fire on my command. 13 warships of the Galactic Dominion pivoted and brought everything they had to bear on a single target. The dark ship did not slow down. It came through the debris field the way water moves through broken ground, not in a straight line, not the direct aggressive charge that Dominion tactical doctrine would have expected from a cornered or outnumbered vessel, but threading, using the mass of the larger asteroid fragments to break targeting solutions, cutting angles that the Dominion's fire control systems kept losing and reacquiring and losing again. It moved like something much smaller than it was. It moved with a decisiveness that felt, to Vasquez, almost like a personality. The way a thing moves when whoever is controlling it knows exactly what it can do and is doing precisely that, right up to the edge, without crossing it. Fire, he said. 13 warships opened up with everything in their arsenal. Captain Elena Vasquez had commanded the Endurance for 9 years. She'd been aboard her for 19 tactical officer, then executive officer, then captain. She knew the sound the ship made when the port lateral thrusters were running warm, a specific harmonic that showed up in the deck vibration before any instrument caught it. She knew the hesitation in the targeting computers when the secondary power relays dropped below 80%, a quarter-second lag that you learned to compensate for without thinking about it. She knew the way the hull felt when it took a hit, not through the damage reports, not through the alert systems, but through the soles of her boots and the frame of her chair and some combination of experience and instinct that 19 years of living on a ship builds into you whether you want it or not. She felt the first salvo hit, and she was already talking before the instruments confirmed it. Report. Lieutenant Commander Torres had been her tactical officer for 6 years. His voice never changed pace regardless of what was happening around him, which was one of the reasons she'd kept him. Outer hull sections 12 through 19, particle beam arrays, wide dispersal, high frequency. Hull integrity 94%. The ablative layers are doing their job, absorbing about 60% of each impact. Recommend rolling to distribute stress. Rolls her. The Endurance rolled, a slow, deliberate movement that brought a fresh section of hull into the line of fire, and the second salvo hit different armor. 91%. Commander David Park, her executive officer for 4 years, had a habit of saying aloud the things everyone was already thinking, on the grounds that numbing a problem was the first step to solving it. 13 ships, he said. We are one ship. I can count, David. I'm just nodding the ratio. Return fire, primary batteries. Those two vessels on the left flank concentrate everything on them. We're still threading the debris field. Targeting solutions are unstable. I know. Fire anyway. She watched the tactical display, the positions of 13 Dominion warships shifting as they tried to establish a clean firing solution on a target that kept moving in ways their computers were having trouble predicting. We're not trying to destroy them right now. We're trying to make them pay attention to us. The Endurance fired, and the deep resonant shudder of the main batteries ran through the entire ship the way a bell rings. You felt it in your chest as much as you heard it. One of the left flank vessels took a direct hit and lurched out of formation. Not destroyed, damaged, distracted. "They're splitting fire," Torres said. "3 vessels on us, the others are maneuvering too. Go through the gap full thrust." The Endurance surged forward, through the hole that the damaged vessel's evasion had opened in the Dominion line, and she was suddenly inside their formation, which was, by any conventional tactical logic, the worst possible position for a single ship to be in against 13. Surrounded, outnumbered on every vector, no clean escape route. It was also the only position from which a single ship could prevent 13 from concentrating their fire without risking hitting each other. "Target the flagship." Torres hesitated not long, less than a second, but she heard it. "That's their fleet command vessel, 3 times our displacement minimum." "I know what it is, fire." The Endurance hit the Eternal Dominion with every primary battery she had, a sustained volley that lit up the tactical display like a sun coming out. The flagship shuddered visibly even at this range, entire sections of outer hull blowing away in silent eruptions of superheated gas, its return fire going wide as its targeting system struggled to compensate. It didn't go down. She hadn't expected it to. But it reeled, and a reeling command vessel meant a reeling fleet, and a reeling fleet made mistakes. 86% hull integrity, Torres said. "Stern sensor arrays are gone, took a direct hit during the pass. We're blind behind us. Compensate with the forward arrays." "Already on it," Park said quietly. "Elena." She looked at him. He was looking at the tactical display, at the positions of the remaining Dominion vessels, at the geometry of what she was asking the Endurance to do. He was doing the math, the way good executive officers always did the math that told you when a plan stopped being aggressive and started being something else. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "David, 2 vessels breaking right flank. They're trying to come around behind us." "I see them." "Let them come. Target the 3rd vessel in the left formation. We punch through and loop around." "Looping around exposes the stern." "Our stern sensors are already gone." He made a sound half-laugh, the kind that comes out when something is too absurd to respond to seriously, and said nothing further. What happened over the next 11 minutes was recorded in Dominion sensor logs as tactically anomalous, which was the kind of language that military bureaucracies use when the truth is too uncomfortable to state plainly. In 11 minutes, the Endurance destroyed 3 Dominion warships outright and left 2 others drifting and disabled. She took damage that accumulated steadily through those 11 minutes, hull integrity dropping from 86 to 71 to 63, systems failing in sequence, atmosphere venting from 3 separate breach points, and she kept fighting through all of it with a consistency and effectiveness that the Dominion's tactical computers, running real-time assessments, kept flagging as statistically improbable. The Dominion ships weren't poorly crewed. The officers commanding them were competent professionals following doctrine that had worked for 3,000 years. The doctrine itself was the problem. It had been built on 3,000 years of engagements with opponents who, when sufficiently damaged, either broke and ran or made a final desperate charge before going down. It had no category for an opponent that absorbed damage past the point where damage should have ended the fight and kept coming, kept adapting, kept pushing into the most dangerous positions rather than away from them. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Commander Jethrow turned from the tactical display to Admiral Vosketh. "Their hull should have failed 8 minutes ago," he said. "It came out quiet, the way things come out when you're saying them to yourself as much as to another person." "I know. The material, the energy dispersal pattern when our weapons hit it, it doesn't match anything in our database. Whatever that hull is made of, we've never seen it." "I know. What is it?" Vosketh watched the Endurance come around on another pass, trailing atmosphere from 3 breach points, moving with the same decisive, unhurried aggression it had moved with from the first moment of the engagement. "I don't know," he said. He would learn, eventually. The hull material was called ablative reactive armor, a layered composite that responded to energy impacts by deliberately sacrificing its outer layers in a controlled thermal reaction, converting incoming energy into heat and venting it away from the structural core. Conceptually simple. The product of 40 years of iterative development, each generation of the material tested in actual combat and refined based on what actually failed rather than what theoretical models said would fail. The Dominion had superior material science in the abstract. They had excellent theory. They had never had a reason to test that theory against sustained combat damage, and so they had never discovered the distance between the theory and the reality. The Endurance had been tested 31 times. She knew what she could take. "Order the fleet to withdraw," Vosketh said. Jethrow stared at him. The word withdraw had not been used in a Dominion fleet engagement in living memory. "Sir." "Order the fleet to withdraw." Same tone, same quietness. "We are fighting something we don't understand. You don't win what you don't understand. Not against this." The Dominion fleet withdrew. The Endurance didn't pursue. She held position in the debris field and watched them go, and Vosketh watched her on the rear sensors as his fleet pulled away. This ship that should have died 6 times in the last 11 minutes, sitting dark and still among the rocks, trailing atmosphere, guns still warm. Just watching them leave. The report that reached Dominion High Command 3 weeks later was the most significant document the Empire had received in a century, and not because of the numbers. 6 ships lost was, in the arithmetic of a fleet 1,000 strong, a rounding error. It was everything surrounding the numbers that mattered. The circumstances, the details, the fact that a single vessel of a species 80 years out of its home system had done this to 14 warships of the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, and had then sat in space and watched the survivors run. High Counselor Merkvel read the report twice. Then he called an emergency session, and the session began the way these sessions always began, with the people around the table reaching, unconsciously, for the explanation that required the least rethinking. General Yothkaron was the senior military voice on the High Council, 300 years old, a being whose entire professional identity was built around the certainty of Dominion supremacy. "Field stress," he said. "Vosketh is an excellent officer, but he was under extreme combat conditions. Sensor anomalies, fire confusion, the chaos of close engagement. What he experienced as a single vessel was likely a concealed force that—" 6 ships, Merkvel said, "can be accounted for by 6 ships destroyed or permanently disabled by what our own admiral, in his own report, states was a single opponent vessel, not a concealed force. 1 ship. Vosketh may have been. I've known Vosketh for 90 years. He has never filed an inaccurate report. He has never been susceptible to field stress." Merkvel set the report down on the table. "I am not dismissing it. I am taking it seriously. And because I am taking it seriously, I am authorizing an intelligence operation. Full assessment. I want to know what we are actually dealing with." The operation was assigned to Agent Sarath. Sarath's species had a mild biological capacity for physical adaptation, not shape-shifting, nothing dramatic, but enough to alter surface features, skin tone, the precise geometry of a face, sufficient to pass as a variety of humanoid types at casual inspection. This, combined with 30 years of field experience and a reputation for bringing back accurate assessments of things other analysts had gotten wrong, made Sareth the Bureau of Intelligence's first choice for operations requiring subtlety. The assignment was simple in its framing and enormous in its implications. Assess the actual military capability of the species called humans. Getting into human space was straightforward. Humans had a principle they called freedom of navigation. Civilian vessels from any species could transit their lanes provided they carried documentation and weren't carrying weapons. The Dominion had not formally declared war. The engagement at Threshold Point was classified in the paperwork as an unauthorized encounter, which was the kind of phrase empires develop when they need to describe something embarrassing without calling it what it was. Sareth arrived at a human border station called Waypoint Kessler, aboard a civilian freighter, carrying credentials identifying her as a materials trader from the Thenari Confederation. The customs officer was a young human man, perhaps 25 years old, who checked her documents, asked her 3 questions about her listed cargo, and waved her through in under 4 minutes. He was not suspicious. He was efficient and professional and completely unremarkable, and she noted him in her file as her first data point. Because the way a species runs its border stations tells you a great deal about how it thinks about strangers, and this one apparently thought about strangers as people to process quickly and send on their way rather than threats to be interrogated and managed. She spent 4 months in human space. The first thing she noticed was the shipyards, and the shipyards were not what the Bureau's files said they were. Every major human system had them, not maintenance facilities, not the modest production infrastructure you'd expect from a species 80 years into interstellar travel. Enormous yards, the kind of industrial capacity that takes decades to build and represents a civilization's serious long-term commitment to naval production. And they were running, not at peacetime maintenance levels. Running the way yards run when a civilization has decided that the number of ships it has is not the number of ships it needs. She spent 3 days near the Proxima yards, observing from distances that wouldn't attract attention, and what she observed redefined her estimate of human production capacity. The Bureau's assessment had been based on detected energy signatures and known facility locations. It had missed, critically, fundamentally missed, the distributed nature of how humans built things. They didn't concentrate their production in massive central facilities. They spread it across hundreds of smaller yards, across all 11 systems, each one capable of producing finished warships, each one survivable if others were destroyed because the network didn't depend on any single node. It was a production architecture designed around the assumption that someone would try to destroy it. It was a lesson she learned from the historical records she accessed during her time there that humanity had learned the hard way, more than once. The second thing she noticed was harder to quantify but more important. In every military force, there is a ratio between personnel with combat experience and personnel without it. This ratio shifts over time based on how much fighting the force has actually done. A military that hasn't fought a serious engagement in a century, like the Dominion's fleet, will have a ratio heavily weighted toward the inexperienced, with a small core of veterans in senior positions and a vast majority of personnel for whom combat exists primarily as a training scenario. The human military's ratio was different. Not because they were at war with an external enemy, they weren't or hadn't been before Threshold Point, but they maintained what amounted to a continuous low-level conflict among themselves, colonial border disputes, piracy suppression, factional disagreements that occasionally became shooting problems, and they rotated their military personnel through these engagements with systematic regularity. It wasn't accidental, it was policy. Someone in the human military's planning apparatus had decided, at some point, that a force without combat experience was a force with an unknown and dangerous liability, and had built a system to ensure that the experience never entirely faded. Captain Vasquez, Sarath confirmed through records that were publicly accessible, had been in 11 combat engagements before threshold point. The average for officers of her rank in the Dominion fleet was 0. The third thing Sarath noticed was the thing she spent the most time trying to explain in her report, because it was the thing that resisted the language of military assessment most stubbornly. It was the relationship between humans and their ships. She observed it most clearly at a commissioning ceremony in the Proxima system, a new vessel being formally entered into service, the kind of event that in the Dominion would involve an official registry entry, a capability certification, and an administrative transfer of command authority. Clean, procedural, complete in under an hour. This took 4 hours. The yard workers were there, the people who had actually built the ship, hundreds of them standing in dress clothes in the cold of the observation bay, the officers and crew who would serve on her, the families of the crew brought in from across the system. A civilian official from the planetary government made a speech about what this vessel represented. A military chaplain, a concept Sarath had to look up, said something she couldn't entirely hear from her position. There was music. There was what she observed as a communal emotional response among the crowd that her instrument suite registered as genuine, not performed. And at the end of it, the captain of the new vessel, a woman in her early 60s, with the kind of face built by decades of serious work, walked to the hull and placed her palm flat against it. She held it there for a moment. She said something quiet enough that Sarath's directional microphone almost missed it. "I'll take care of you." Sarath filed this under cultural factors, psychological, and wrote 3 paragraphs trying to explain what it meant. She'd read enough human history by then to understand, intellectually, what she was observing, a tradition that ran back centuries, to the days when humans crossed their planet's oceans in wooden vessels and called those vessels she and gave them names and believed, in some way that was partly superstition and partly something harder to dismiss, that the relationship between a crew and their ship was a real thing with real consequences. The tradition had survived into space because the thing it was tracking was real. A crew that knew their ship genuinely knew her, the way you know something you have lived with and depended on and brought home damaged and repaired and taken out again, was a different thing from a crew that operated a platform. The closest Sarath came to capturing it in her report was this: a human warship is not, within the human psychological and cultural framework, equipment. It is not a platform or an asset or a force projection system. It occupies a category that sits between partner and responsibility, and the relationship between a crew and their vessel produces a combat effectiveness and a willingness to sustain damage while maintaining function that cannot be fully accounted for by training metrics or technical capability assessments. This factor does not appear in any standard military evaluation framework. It should. She submitted her report and flew back to Dominion space. Merkvel read it in one sitting. He called an emergency session of the High Council. Yothkaron read it and made the same move he had made with Vasquez's report, reaching for the interpretation that required the least adjustment to what he already believed. One operative's assessment. Informed, experienced, but still, extrapolations from limited observation. The shipyard estimates are projections, not confirmed figures. The cultural analysis is interesting, but its military relevance is speculative. Sarath has never overstated a threat in 30 years, Merkvel said. Which makes this report concerning precisely because it reads like an overstatement. Yothkaron set the document down. One ship's anomalous performance and an intelligence operative who became too interested in the culture she was studying. That's what I'm reading. And the shipyard production estimates. Projections, we don't know they're accurate. Merkvel looked around the table. He saw in every face there a version of what Yoth was doing, not dishonesty, not willful ignorance, but the deep structural resistance of an institution that had been right for 3,000 years, and had therefore never had to build the habit of reconsidering itself. "What do you recommend?" he asked Yoth. "Full demonstration of force. The war armada, 200 vessels, arrive in their space, establish the reality of what they're facing, offer terms. One anomalous ship is one anomalous ship. 200 warships are not an anomaly. They will accept protectorate status. And if they don't?" Yoth looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "Then we will have 200 ships and they will have whatever they have, and we will win." Merkvel authorized the deployment. The war armada assembled over 3 weeks and crossed into the threshold system on a Tuesday, a detail that appeared in human records of the event and meant nothing to anyone in the Dominion, who had no concept of a 7-day week built around a moon most of the fleet had never seen. 200 warships. Fleet Admiral Drosyeth commanding, pulled from semi-retirement for this operation because he was the most decorated combat commander in Dominion history, and this was the kind of situation where you wanted your most decorated combat commander, even if the expectation was that he wouldn't need to do much. The war armada had been deployed 7 times in 3,000 years. 7 times, the species it was deployed against had looked at what was sitting in their space and accepted protectorate status. 7 times, not a shot had been fired. Drosyeth had read both reports, Vosketh's and Sarath's, and his assessment sat between Yoth dismissal and Sarath's alarm. 22 ships against 200 was a ratio that mathematics could only read one way. Whatever the endurance had done at threshold point, one ship's anomalous performance did not a fleet make. You could be extraordinary with one crew, one vessel, one set of circumstances. You could not sustain extraordinary across 22 ships and maintain the kind of coordinated tactical response that 200 warships would require you to answer. He was wrong about that. He would understand why later. The Dominion's communication array broadcast on all frequencies, in the human language. They had bothered to translate it this time, which represented a concession they didn't acknowledge, informing the Interstellar Compact that the Galactic Dominion was prepared to offer full protectorate status, integration benefits, and a treaty of cooperation in exchange for recognition of Dominion authority. The message noted, with the particular diplomacy of people pointing 200 warships at you while asking nicely, that refusal was an available option, and that its consequences were visible on any sensor array the Compact cared to operate. The response came 40 minutes later. 22 ships dropped out of FTL at the edge of sensor range and held position. Drosyeth looked at his tactical display. He looked at 22 vessels, their sensor profiles consistent with what Vosketh had described, low emissions, materials that didn't respond to scanning the way materials were supposed to respond. He looked at them sitting motionless, not advancing, not retreating, just there. "Why aren't they responding to the communication?" asked Vice Admiral Nethshan. "They're making us come to them." Drosyeth understood the tactic even if he'd never encountered it before. Force the larger fleet to advance and break formation. Extend the engagement timeline. Create conditions that favor the side with fewer but potentially more capable individual vessels. Advance formation, half speed, keep the line intact. 200 Dominion warships moved forward. The 22 human ships didn't move. When the Armada reached optimal engagement range, Drosyeth transmitted a final communication. Accept terms within 10 minutes or face the full capacity of the war armada. The response came in 8 minutes from Admiral Chen Wei, and it was 3 sentences. Terms declined. You came into our space and destroyed ships that were not threatening you. We remember. Then the human fleet moved. What followed at the Battle of the Kareth Nebula was recorded in fragments from both sides, and the fragments don't entirely agree, because no single observer could track everything that happened simultaneously across a 4-hour engagement involving 222 warships. What the fragments agree on is the character of what happened, the shape of it, what it felt like from inside. The 22 human ships didn't fight like 22 ships. They moved like a single organism with 22 bodies, the coordination between them so tight and so continuous that Dominion Tactical Analysis would spend months afterward trying to understand how it was possible with the communication technology they were supposed to have. It wasn't possible with the communication technology they were supposed to have. What they were actually using was a tight beam quantum entanglement system that Dominion intelligence hadn't detected because it didn't know to look for it. Admiral Chenway drove his fleet directly into the center of the Dominion formation, not the edges, where conventional doctrine said a smaller force should probe. The center, into the heaviest fire, into the worst position, because the center of a 200-ship formation was the one place where 200 ships couldn't concentrate on a target without the risk of shooting each other, and it was the place from which 22 ships with enough coordination could do the most damage in the shortest time. Drosyeth had anticipated something like this. He'd adjusted his formation to account for it. What he hadn't anticipated was the targeting sequence. The human fleet wasn't hitting the biggest ships or the most powerful weapons platforms. They were hitting specific vessels in a specific order, not random, not opportunistic, but deliberate and precise, following a sequence that Drosyeth recognized, with a cold shock that settled in his chest and stayed there, as a systematic dismantling of his fleet's command and communication architecture. They had mapped the organizational structure of his fleet. They knew which vessels coordinated which sectors of the formation. They knew which ships, if removed, would create the largest gaps in fleet cohesion, and they were removing them in an order that maximized the cascading disruption. "They know our command structure," Nethshan said. "Yes," Drosyeth said. He was already thinking through the implications. Sarath's operation had been observed, or there had been other intelligence operations the Bureau hadn't known about. While the Dominion had been studying humanity, humanity had been studying the Dominion, and had apparently been doing it longer and more thoroughly. They've been preparing for this. For how long? He didn't answer because he didn't know, and because the answer didn't change what was happening right now. 4 hours. In 4 hours of continuous engagement, Drosyeth lost 37 ships destroyed or permanently disabled. Another 22 were damaged to reduced effectiveness. The human fleet lost 4 ships destroyed and had most of the remaining vessels damaged to varying degrees, but they were still there, still coordinated, still pressing, and there was a quality to how they fought that Drosyeth had never encountered and didn't have a name for. Wasn't recklessness. That was what it looked like from outside, maybe, the willingness to take damage and keep going, to push into positions that conventional doctrine would classify as suicidal. But from his side of the engagement, watching them, he could see that it wasn't reckless at all. It was calculated. Each human vessel seemed to know precisely how much it could absorb and precisely what it needed to do before it reached that limit, and it operated right at that edge with a consistency that wasn't luck. It was experience. It was what you looked like when you had learned, over many engagements and many years, exactly where the line was. At the 2-hour mark, Drosyeth did something he had never done in 300 years of service. He called Merkvel on a secure channel and asked for authorization to withdraw or to escalate to total destruction protocols. The weapons the Dominion possessed but had never deployed, the ones that ended things permanently. His bridge crew heard him ask. He watched their faces as the meaning landed. Merkvel's response came after 11 minutes. The battle continued for every one of those 11 minutes. Withdraw, do not escalate. Establish a defensive perimeter at Sector 9 Alpha. 200 ships, minus the 37 that couldn't follow, turned and left. On the bridge of his flagship, Drosyeth watched the human vessels on the rear sensors. They didn't pursue. They held position and watched the armada go, and what he felt, watching them, was something he needed a long time to identify because he had never felt it before and hadn't known he was capable of it. Not defeat exactly. Something more specific than defeat. The feeling of having knocked on a door and heard something on the other side, something large and patient, and understood that you didn't know what it was and that it had known you were coming before you arrived. Subcommander Pethriath had been taken prisoner when the Iron Constancy was boarded in the third hour of the battle. He'd been on his vessel for 11 years. He knew her the way you know a place you've spent more of your adult life than anywhere else. The particular sound she made under acceleration, the lighting in the lower decks that had been slightly off since a repair job 2 years ago, and that nobody had gotten around to fully fixing, the smell of the air near the port engine housing after a long burn. He'd been in the engine room when the breach happened, and he'd fought the boarding team with everything his crew had, and it hadn't been enough. And now he was in a secure compartment aboard a human vessel with 17 of his people, drinking water from a container that tasted slightly wrong and waiting to understand what happened next. What happened next was a woman. She was perhaps 50 years old, gray at the edges of her dark hair, with the kind of face that had been through enough to leave marks and had come out the other side of those marks with something that looked, if he was reading human expressions correctly, like steadiness. She was in a uniform with no rank insignia visible. She carried 2 cups of something hot and sat in a chair she had brought with her and looked at him across the space between them with an attention that felt evaluating but not hostile. "You want to understand what happened," she said. It took him a moment to recognize it wasn't a question. Yes. What specifically? He thought about it. There were many things he wanted to understand, but there was one that sat at the center of all of them. You could have killed us. You had every advantage. You chose not to. Yes. Why? She turned her cup in her hands. The steam rose between them. Because you weren't a threat anymore. You were beaten. Killing people who have already lost doesn't accomplish anything except making us worse. She said it simply, the way you say something you've thought about enough that it has stopped feeling like a position and started feeling like a fact. The Dominion would not have extended the same. I know what the Dominion would have done. Not unkindly, factually, I've read your military doctrine. Then you know we are not a species that typically. I know you're not, right now, a threat to my crew. That's what I'm working with. Pethriath was quiet. He looked around the compartment at his people, at the functional plainness of the space, at the cups she'd brought. Small things. The kind of small things that were easy to not do and that someone had chosen to do anyway. "What do you want from this conversation?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to carry something back when you go home. And you will go home prisoner exchange when this reaches the stage where there's something to negotiate." "Carry what back?" "An understanding of what you're dealing with." She set down her cup. "Not a threat, an honest assessment. From a human captain. From someone who's been doing this long enough to know the difference between a fight that needed to happen and a fight that didn't." She looked at him steadily. "You came into our space. We weren't in yours. We weren't threatening you. We were here existing, and your government decided that was a problem that needed to be solved. The Dominion's expansion protocols. I'm not asking you to defend them. I'm asking you to look at where those protocols led right now today." She gestured, a small movement that seemed to encompass everything around them, the damaged ship, the situation, the 37 vessels his side had lost. "You assumed you knew what we were. You looked at 80 years and you saw something young and small and primitive, and you thought you knew what that meant. It is a reasonable assumption for a species of your age." "It was a reasonable assumption," she said, "and it was wrong, because the 80 years you were looking at weren't the only years that mattered. We have been at war in one form or another for most of our recorded history, not with you, with each other. And that has produced something that doesn't show up on a technology assessment or a capability readout. She paused. Can I ask you something? He waited. What does your military train for? Pethriath considered the question. Combat scenarios, strategic engagements, fleet coordination, defense of Dominion territory against. Against what? He paused. Theoretically, he said, against any threat. And in practice, in the last 100 years, how many serious threats has the Dominion fleet actually faced? He didn't answer, because the answer was obvious and they both knew it. We have never had that problem, she said. We have always had a threat. For 10,000 years, the threat was each other, which meant we had to get very, very good at the actual practice of it, not the theory, not the simulation, the practice. What it feels like when things go wrong. What it costs. How long the cost lasts. How you keep fighting after you've lost people you trained with and slept near and shared meals with for years. She was quiet for a moment. You learn things from that you can't learn any other way. Including how to fight a fleet 10 times your size, Pethriath said. Including that, she stood, picking up her chair. We didn't want this fight. I want to be clear about that. Not because we were afraid of it, we weren't. And I think you know we weren't now, but because it didn't need to happen. It happened because your government looked at us and made an assumption, and then sent ships to act on that assumption without finding out first whether the assumption was right. She moved toward the door. One more question, Pethriath said. She stopped. Your captain at threshold point, 1 ship against 14. He had read the reports. Everyone in the Dominion fleet had read the reports or would, eventually. What was she thinking? The woman at the door was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about her ship, she said. She was thinking about her crew. She was thinking about what the Endurance could do and what she needed her to do and how close those two things were. A pause. And she was thinking that you'd come into her space, and that she remembered that. She left. Pethriath sat for a long time after the door closed. He sat with the cup of wrong-tasting water and the slightly wrong-smelling air and the sounds of a human ship around him. Different sounds than the iron constancy made, different rhythms, but with the same quality of a place that knew what it was and had been lived in long enough to show it. He sat and he thought about what she had said, and about what he had seen, and about the 37 ships that weren't coming home, and about the 200 ships that had run from 22. He thought about the assumption. He thought about what it would mean to go back and try to explain to people who had been assuming for 3,000 years that this particular assumption had been wrong. High Counselor Merkvel received the formal communication from the Interstellar Compact's diplomatic office 14 days after the Battle of the Kereth Nebula. It was not a demand for surrender. It was not a list of territorial claims or reparations. It was, in its structure and language, a request, carefully worded, formally presented, leaving Dominion dignity intact in ways it didn't have to. The Compact was requesting a ceasefire. It was requesting the establishment of a neutral zone between human space and Dominion space. It was requesting the immediate return of prisoners of war on both sides. And it was requesting, in terms that were polite but left no ambiguity about what they meant, that the Dominion's expansion protocols be suspended with regard to human-occupied systems and their immediate neighbors indefinitely. Merkvel called it a ceasefire request in the High Council session. Yathkaran called it what it was. They're dictating terms, he said. The fury in his voice was old, the fury of a being whose entire framework for understanding the galaxy was requiring an adjustment it didn't want to make. A species 80 years in space is dictating terms to a 3,000-year empire. Yes, Merkvel said. We have 163 ships remaining in the war armada. We have thousands more in other deployments. We have the capacity to. To do what exactly? Merkvel's voice was very quiet. Escalate to total destruction protocols against a species that has done nothing except defend itself when we came into its space and fired on its ships. He looked around the table. I'm trying to understand what victory looks like in that scenario. I'm trying to understand what we become if we pursue it. The silence in the room was the silence of people who had thought of themselves as a certain kind of civilization for 3,000 years, and were being asked, in the space of a few weeks, to reconsider that. Accept the terms, Merkvel said. It was the first ceasefire request the Galactic Dominion had accepted in 3,000 years of expansion. The first time the Empire had looked at another species and decided that the conversation was over because the other species had ended it, not because the Dominion had. The prisoner exchange took place 6 weeks later at a neutral station in the space between human and Dominion territory. Pethriath was among the Dominion personnel returned. He crossed the transfer corridor into Dominion space, and on the other side, Dominion medical staff took his vitals and debriefed him and declared him psychologically fit for duty, which was accurate in the narrow technical sense and missed several things that weren't measurable on a standard psychological assessment. He was transferred to a recovery posting on Dominion Station 7, a large installation at the edge of what was now, officially, the neutral zone. His quarters had a window that looked toward human space, though there was nothing to see in that direction except stars. A week after his return, he found himself at that window in the early hours of the station's artificial morning, when the corridors were quiet and the light through the viewport was the unchanged black of deep space. He was looking toward human space. There was nothing to see. But he had requested, through channels that required some explanation and some persistence, access to the long-range optical feeds from the station's external sensor array. And through those feeds, at maximum magnification, he could see, faintly, at the edge of resolution, the lights of what the station's sensors had identified as a human shipyard. He'd been watching it for several days. It never stopped. Day cycle, night cycle, around the clock by any measure, the shipyard worked. Lights moving along hull sections under construction, the slow growth of new frames in the dry dock berths, the particular pattern of activity that meant a vessel was being fitted out, its systems being brought online for the first time. A Dominion medical officer found him there one morning and asked what he was looking at. The human yards, Pethriath said. The medical officer looked at the screen. You can barely see them at this range. I know. The officer looked at the image for a moment, the faint lights, the distant activity. Does it worry you, watching them build? Pethriath thought about the woman who had sat across from him in the compartment aboard the human vessel. He thought about what she had said about assumptions, and about what 10,000 years of fighting yourself teaches you that nothing else does. He thought about the Endurance sitting in the debris field, watching 14 warships leave, not pursuing, just watching. I met a human officer, he said. During the prisoner period, she told me something. What did she tell you? She said they only build more when someone gives them a reason to. The medical officer didn't say anything. He looked at the distant lights for a moment, and then he left, and Pethriath stayed at the window. Somewhere in that distant light was a ship being born. It would be named. Already was named probably before its keel was laid, because that was how humans did it. It would be named and it would be given a crew, and the crew would learn her, would come to know the specific sound she made and the specific way she felt under acceleration, would bring her into combat someday and bring her home damaged and fix what was broken and go out again. And when someone asked them why they kept fighting, why they absorbed damage that should have stopped them and kept going, why they pushed into the worst positions and came out the other side, they would say what soldiers of any species say, which is that they were doing it for the person beside them. But there would be something else underneath that. Something they probably didn't say out loud because they'd lived with it long enough that it felt obvious, felt like just the way things were. They would be doing it for the ship. The Dominion had found at the edge of Sector 7 Gamma Null what it had been looking for: a new protectorate, a young species, a straightforward conversation. It had found something else entirely. And in the quiet of Station 7's early morning, With the lights of a human shipyard burning at the limit of what optics could resolve, Pethriath understood something that he would spend the rest of his career trying to explain to people who hadn't been in that compartment, hadn't sat across from that woman, hadn't watched 22 ships make 200 run. The Dominion hadn't found the limit of what humanity was. They had found where it started,